3 days ago, those lawyers stood in my barn and suggested I find someone educated enough to explain property law to me. That sentence was running through my head when the courtroom doors closed at 9:17 on Monday morning. I could smell old oak, floor polish, and the faint bitterness of coffee drifting from somewhere behind the clerk's station. Martin Cole sat at counsel table with Rebecca Sloan and Peter Walsh beside him, 3 expensive suits arranged behind 3 leather briefcases. Vanessa Harrow sat 1 row behind them in a navy blazer, her blonde hair perfectly set, one hand resting on a thick folder carrying the Brierwood Estates emblem. She looked comfortable, confident, almost pleased. Then the bailiff stepped forward. All rise. Chairs scraped across the floor. Papers stopped moving. Martin buttoned his jacket. Rebecca closed her legal pad. Peter pushed his glasses higher on his nose. Vanessa stood last. The door behind the bench opened, and I walked into the courtroom wearing my black judicial robe. Martin saw me first. His expression emptied so quickly that I almost missed it. Rebecca stared at my face, then at the nameplate on the bench. Peter looked down at the business card I had handed him 3 days earlier and slowly turned it over as though the other side might contain an explanation. Vanessa did not move at all. I took my seat, arranged the docket in front of me, and looked across the courtroom. Nobody said a word. That was fine with me. I had spent enough years on the bench to know silence could reveal more than argument ever did. What they did not understand yet was that their dispute over my farm was not before me that morning, and it never would be. I would not use a robe to settle a private property fight. I would not need to. The matter on my docket was unrelated, and I handled it exactly as I would have handled it if I had never seen any of them standing beside my barn. Still, I could feel their attention every time I turned a page. 3 days earlier, Martin had looked at the mud on my boots and told me recorded property rights were more complicated than fence lines. Rebecca had slid a proposed easement across my workbench like the conversation was already finished. Peter had explained how expensive litigation could become for a man trying to protect 84 acres of family farmland. Vanessa had stood behind them smiling, as if bringing 3 attorneys onto my gravel driveway had somehow changed the deed. I had asked only one question. Which recording book contains your easement? Nobody answered it. Now Martin sat 15 feet from my bench, and he finally understood why I had asked. When the unrelated morning calendar ended, I closed the file in front of me. The bailiff called recess. I stood. Martin rose quickly. Your Honor, about the Whitmore property. I stopped and looked at him. Counsel, any private matter involving my property goes through my attorney. His mouth closed. I left the courtroom without another word. The robe had surprised them. But the robe was not the problem waiting for Brierwood Estates. The real problem was sitting 42 miles away in a fireproof cabinet inside my farmhouse, beneath a stack of surveys and 70 years of recorded deeds. Long before anyone called me Your Honor, Whitmore Farm taught me that ownership was mostly maintenance. At 5:40 every morning, before the courthouse existed in my day, there was the metallic click of the barn latch, the smell of hay and damp Virginia soil, and the low diesel rumble of my old utility tractor warming beside the equipment shed. The farm covered 84 acres of rolling pasture, hardwood trees, and fenced fields that had been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather bought the first parcel when the county road was still gravel. My father added the western pasture years later. By the time the land came to me, every boundary had a story attached to it. I knew where the old survey monuments sat beneath weeds. I knew which fence followed the recorded property line and which one had been moved inward years ago to clear a drainage ditch. I knew the narrow strip along the eastern ridge because I had replaced nearly 800 feet of fence there myself. That strip would eventually become the reason Vanessa Harrow started paying attention to me. Until then, my mornings were simple. Feed the animals, check the gates, repair whatever weather had loosened overnight. That particular Thursday, I was replacing a warped fence board when sunlight finally cleared the ridge. My work gloves smelled like cedar and machine oil. Mud covered the edges of my boots. My pickup sat beside the barn with a black garment bag hanging behind the driver's seat and a leather briefcase lying flat beneath an old canvas jacket. A courthouse parking permit rested face down near the windshield. Nobody passing on the county road would have noticed any of it. I preferred it that way. Out there, I was not Judge Whitmore. I was Ethan, the man who borrowed a neighbor's post-hole auger and returned it with a full tank. Around 7, I went inside the farmhouse for coffee. The kitchen windows faced east toward the newest section of Brierwood estates, where large houses with stone entrances had appeared beyond my tree line over the previous 4 years. The development was neat, expensive, and close enough that on quiet evenings I could sometimes hear landscaping equipment across the ridge. I had nothing against the people living there. Their property ended where mine began, and for several years that simple fact had been enough. Then I found Vanessa's envelope beneath the mailbox flag. Heavy cream paper. Brierwood Estates Homeowners Association printed across the top. Inside was a proposal concerning what she called a community connectivity improvement. They wanted a 40-foot wide corridor across my eastern acreage for a secondary access road and landscaped greenway. The offer attached to it was considerably less interesting than the land they wanted. I read every page at the kitchen table while my coffee cooled. Then I read the legal description twice. Something was missing. There was language about neighborhood planning, emergency access, community benefit, and future development, but nothing showing Brierwood already possessed a recorded right across Whitmore Farm. I folded the papers back into the envelope and left for work. 2 days later, Vanessa arrived at my barn in a polished sport utility vehicle. She wore a cream jacket and carried another folder. "Mr. Whitmore, I wanted to discuss our proposal personally." I set down my hammer. "I read it." She smiled. "Then you understand why the corridor makes sense. For Brierwood, maybe. For the entire community." I looked toward the eastern fence. "I am not selling it." Her smile held for another second before changing. "You should understand that there may already be community rights affecting that portion of the property." I wiped sawdust from my glove. "Recorded where?" For the first time, Vanessa looked down at her folder instead of at me. Vanessa kept her eyes on the folder for just long enough to answer my question without saying anything. Then she recovered. "The original development documents are complicated," she said. "Our council has reviewed them." I leaned against the fence post and waited. A warm breeze carried the smell of cut grass across the eastern pasture. Somewhere inside the barn, an old box fan hummed against the August heat. "Then your council should have the recording information," I said. Vanessa closed the folder. "The point is that Brierwood has legitimate interests here. An interest is not an easement." Her expression tightened. "You seem very certain about that." "I am certain about what is written in my deed." She looked beyond me toward the pasture, tracing the route she wanted with her eyes. 40 feet did not sound like much until you followed it across nearly half a mile of productive land. Their preferred corridor would cut along my eastern boundary, cross a drainage swale, and connect Brierwood's newest section with the county road south of my property. The alternative route stayed entirely outside Whitmore Farm, but it required additional grading and a longer stretch of pavement. Vanessa had never mentioned that part. I knew because I had already seen the county planning maps. "We are prepared to improve the offer," she said. "I am not interested." "You have not heard the number." The answer is still no. Her polite smile disappeared. "Mr. Whitmore, development is happening whether you approve of it or not." I looked toward the new rooftops beyond the trees. "I have never objected to your development." "You are blocking necessary access across land you do not own." She took a slow breath. "Our attorneys believe an older covenant may establish access rights benefiting the surrounding community." There it was. Not does establish. May establish. I had spent enough time listening to carefully chosen words to recognize the difference. "Send me the instrument," I said. "We will." Vanessa returned to her vehicle and left a thin cloud of dust hanging over the gravel. 4 days later, a certified envelope arrived from a Richmond law firm. The letter was 6 pages long and far more aggressive than Vanessa had been in person. It referenced historical development patterns, successor interests, equitable access, and possible injunctive relief if I interfered with what they described as Brierwood's rights. What it did not contain was the one thing I had requested, a recorded easement granting them access across my farm. I read it twice at the kitchen table. Then I opened the fireproof cabinet in my study. My grandfather's deed rested inside a worn manila folder beside later surveys, plats, tax records, and title documents my father had preserved. The paper smelled faintly of dust and old cardboard. I compared the legal description in the deed with the parcel numbers in Brierwood's letter. Something did not match. Their argument appeared to depend on language from land east of mine, property that had once belonged to a different family entirely. I did not answer them myself. The next morning, I called Laura Bennett, an attorney I had known professionally for years but had never needed for my own property. I emailed her the letter and scanned copies of the relevant deeds. She called back before lunch. "Ethan, do these people know what you do for a living?" I looked through my courthouse office window at the brick buildings across the square. "I do not think so." Laura was quiet for a moment. "Do you want me to tell them?" I thought about Vanessa's phrase, older covenant. Then I thought about the missing recording information. "No," I said. "First, I want them to show us exactly what they believe gives them the right to cross my farm." They arrived at Whitmore Farm at 8:12 on Friday morning in two black sport utility vehicles clean enough to reflect the barn roof. I was kneeling beside an irrigation valve when tires crunched across the gravel. The air smelled of wet soil, cut hay, and the mineral tang of water leaking around the fitting I had just replaced. Vanessa stepped out first in her cream jacket. Martin Cole followed carrying a leather briefcase. Then Rebecca Sloan with a thick document folder, and Peter Walsh with a legal pad tucked beneath his arm. 3 lawyers. 1 farm. Vanessa had apparently decided that if one letter could not move me, a small delegation might. I stood, wiped my hands on a shop towel, and walked toward them in muddy boots and a faded work shirt. Martin looked me over before offering his hand. "Mr. Whitmore, we are hoping to resolve this without unnecessary litigation." "So am I." We moved into the barn where an old wooden workbench gave them enough room to spread out their papers. Rebecca placed a proposed easement in front of me. Peter added a survey sketch showing a 40-foot corridor running along my eastern acreage. Martin began explaining successor rights and historical access in the patient tone people sometimes use when they have already decided the listener cannot understand them. I let him finish. Then I pointed at the sketch. "Who prepared this?" Peter gave me the name of a consulting firm. "Is it recorded?" He hesitated. "It is illustrative." "So no." Martin leaned forward. "Property law is more complicated than fence lines, Mr. Whitmore." I looked at him. "Usually. Which recording book is your easement in?" Nobody answered. The box fan rattled behind us. A horse shifted in the neighboring stall. Rebecca opened another folder. "Our position is not dependent on a single instrument." "Then give me the chain of title supporting your position." She glanced at Martin. Peter stepped in next. "You should understand that litigation over access rights can become expensive very quickly." "I understand. Even when a property owner believes he is correct." "I understand that too." Vanessa crossed her arms. "Ethan, Brierwood has tried to be reasonable. You offered to buy land. I declined. Then you claimed you might already have rights to it. I asked you to identify those rights." Martin slid a letter toward me. "This outlines our legal position." I read the first page, then the second. The same phrases appeared again. Historical use, community benefit, equitable access. Still no recorded instrument crossing Whitmore Farm. I folded the letter and set it beside the proposed easement. "Then file whatever you believe you can prove." The room became very quiet. Vanessa stared at me. "By the time this is over, you may wish you had sold." I did not raise my voice. "Is that part of your legal position too?" Martin shifted in his chair. Rebecca looked down at her papers. Vanessa's jaw tightened. 10 minutes later, they packed their folders and walked back toward the vehicles. Before Martin reached the barn door, I handed him my business card. It carried my name and private contact information, nothing about the courthouse. He slipped it into his folder without really looking at it. I watched the vehicles disappear down the gravel drive, then returned to the irrigation valve. My black garment bag hung behind the seat of my pickup, ready for Monday morning. Vanessa had brought 3 lawyers because she thought numbers created authority. What she had actually brought me were 3 witnesses to every question they still could not answer. By noon, Laura had copies of everything they left behind, including the illustrative survey Peter had placed on my workbench. She called while I was replacing a hinge on the equipment shed. "They changed theories again," she said. I set the wrench down. "Which one are we on now?" "Implied access, historical benefit, and something they are calling successor community rights." "Recorded instrument." Still nothing. I could hear pages turning on her end. "Their sketch bothers me more. The parcel references do not line up with your eastern boundary." I already knew that, but hearing Laura confirm it mattered. That afternoon, she ordered certified copies of the relevant deeds and plats from the county records office. I did nothing dramatic. I finished the hinge, checked the south pasture, and drove into town before sunset. Saturday morning brought another certified letter. This one warned that Brierwood might seek injunctive relief and recover legal expenses if I obstructed access they claimed already existed. Sunday brought an email attaching a draft complaint. Every new document went into the same folder. Dates, names, claims, parcel numbers. I learned early in my career that people become careless when they believe repetition can substitute for proof. By Sunday evening, the dining room table was covered with 70 years of Whitmore records. My grandfather's original deed sat beneath a glass paperweight. Beside it were my father's survey, a later recorded plat, tax maps, and the title report Laura had requested. The smell of old paper mixed with fresh coffee while rain tapped against the windows. I traced the eastern boundary with my finger. The language Brierwood kept citing belonged to a neighboring tract that had been subdivided decades earlier. Whitmore Farm was described separately. Different grantor, different legal description, different chain of title. Most important, nothing in the documents before us granted Brierwood the 40-foot corridor Vanessa wanted. Laura called again at 7:30. I found the alternative access plan. Where? County planning file. Brierwood submitted it 18 months ago. I leaned back in my chair. So they already have another route. Apparently, it is longer and requires more grading. That explained the sudden urgency. My land was not their only path. It was their cheaper path. Do not contact them tonight, I said. I was about to tell you the same thing. I smiled. That is why I hired you. Monday morning, I left the farm before 7. My boots were clean this time. The black garment bag lay across the back seat, and my leather briefcase rested beside it. 42 miles later, I pulled into the courthouse parking area, entered through the secured employee entrance, and changed in chambers. Before the morning calendar, my clerk handed me the appearance list. Martin Cole, Rebecca Sloan, Peter Walsh. Their firm represented a party in an unrelated civil matter scheduled before me. I stared at the names for several seconds. Then, I checked the conflict information carefully. Nothing connected that case to Whitmore Farm or Brierwood. Still, I made a note to keep every private matter completely separate. At 9:17, the courtroom doors closed. I heard chairs shifting beyond the wall. The bailiff stepped into position. I slipped my arms into the robe, straightened the collar, and picked up the docket. 3 days earlier, Martin had told me property law was more complicated than fence lines. In another few seconds, he was going to discover that I had understood every word he said. The bailiff's voice carried through the courtroom. All rise. I stepped through the door behind the bench with the docket in my left hand, and the room changed before I reached my chair. Martin recognized me first. The confident expression he had worn inside my barn disappeared. Rebecca looked from my face to the nameplate on the bench, then back again. Peter froze with his pen above his legal pad. Behind them, Vanessa stood completely still, her folder pressed against her side. I took my seat. Please be seated. Chairs moved across the polished floor. Nobody mentioned Whitmore Farm. Neither did I. The case before me involved a commercial contract dispute with no connection to Brierwood, my property, or anyone personally involved in my land dispute beyond the attorneys representing one party. I handled the calendar exactly as I would on any other Monday. I listened. I asked questions. I ruled only on matters properly before the court. Martin's voice sounded less certain than it had 3 days earlier, but his presentation remained professional. Rebecca passed him documents without looking toward me. Peter wrote constantly. Vanessa had apparently come expecting to watch their unrelated proceeding before continuing whatever strategy she had planned for my farm. Instead, she spent most of the hearing staring at the bench as though the wood itself had betrayed her. When the matter concluded, I announced recess and closed the file. Martin stood before I could leave. Your Honor, about the Whitmore property. I looked directly at him. Counsel, any private matter involving my property goes through my attorney. He nodded immediately. Understood. Thank you. That was all. No threat. No lecture. No reminder of what he had said in my barn. I returned to chambers, removed the robe, and hung it behind the door. My phone showed a message from Laura. Call when free. I called. I assume they know now, she said. They know my occupation. Vanessa? She was there. Laura exhaled softly. Good. Then we need to make something very clear before they invent another problem. You will have nothing to do with any judicial proceeding involving this dispute. Agreed. We had already discussed it, but I wanted the boundary unmistakable. If Brierwood filed anything involving Whitmore Farm, I would not hear it. I would not select who did. I would not discuss it with courthouse staff beyond whatever formal ethics procedures were required. I was a landowner in this dispute, nothing more. Laura would represent me, and an independent judge would handle anything that reached court. Then she gave me the news that mattered more than the morning reveal. The certified title documents had arrived. Ethan, the covenant they are relying on does exist. I stopped beside my desk. But it applies to the old Harwood tract east of your property, not Whitmore Farm. I looked through the courthouse window at rainwater shining on the street below. And the access corridor? I cannot find one recorded across your parcel. What about their alternative route? Still in the county planning file. It adds construction cost, but it avoids your land completely. There it was. The Robe had explained why their faces changed that morning. The records were about to explain why their entire strategy had to change next. By Tuesday afternoon, Laura had assembled the title package into something even Vanessa could not blur with phrases like community benefit. The certified deed described Whitmore Farm by meets and bounds. The recorded plat matched it. The old covenant Martin had relied on belonged to the Harwood tract east of my boundary, and the county planning file contained Brierwood's alternative access route in black and white. It was longer, required additional grading, and cost more money, but it existed entirely without crossing my land. Laura sent Brierwood's attorneys a formal response with the relevant recording references attached. She did not mention my position at the courthouse except to state that all communications concerning my private property were to come through her office. By 4:30, Martin called her. By 5, Rebecca emailed requesting additional time to review the title records. Peter said nothing. Vanessa did. Her email arrived shortly before dinner. She accused me of withholding material information about my profession and suggested that my position created an unfair advantage. I read that sentence twice while standing at the kitchen counter. Then I forwarded it to Laura without answering. She called 10 minutes later. You did not owe them your resume before refusing to sell your land. I know. And being a judge does not change the deed. That is the part one want kept clear. The next morning, I completed the formal steps necessary to ensure that any litigation involving Whitmore Farm would be handled entirely outside my courtroom. I documented the conflict and removed myself from any judicial role connected to the dispute. I did not call another judge. I did not ask courthouse staff who might receive the matter. I went to work, handled my assigned docket, drove home, changed into work clothes, and repaired a gate near the eastern pasture. The difference between authority and entitlement is sometimes that ordinary. Vanessa apparently expected the robe to become a weapon. Instead, I left it hanging in chambers. 2 days later, Brierwood filed its civil action anyway. Laura called me from her office. They narrowed the claim, meaning they are no longer saying the covenant directly covers Whitmore Farm. Now they want the court to recognize access based on historical use and necessity. I looked across the pasture toward Brierwood's rooftops. Historical use by whom? That is one of several questions they are going to have to answer. We already had dated aerial photographs, fence records, tax maps, and my father's surveys. None showed a Brierwood road crossing the farm. The necessity argument had another problem. Their own planning documents showed the alternative route. More expensive did not mean impossible. Then Laura found the detail that turned a weak claim into a board problem. The alternative route had been presented to Brierwood 18 months earlier, complete with estimated construction costs. Vanessa had attended the meeting. Her name appeared in the minutes. Yet the letters sent to me repeatedly described my land as necessary access. I sat at the dining room table with my grandfather's deed on one side and Brierwood's meeting minutes on the other. For weeks, Vanessa had acted as though the biggest secret in this dispute was my occupation. It was not. The bigger secret was buried in her own association records. She had known there was another route before she ever drove onto my farm and told me the community had rights over land it did not own. The hearing took place 6 weeks later in a courthouse 2 counties away, which suited me perfectly. That morning, my robe stayed 42 miles behind me in chambers. I wore a charcoal suit, sat beside Laura at counsel table, and entered the room as exactly what I was in this dispute, a landowner protecting 84 acres of family property. Vanessa sat across the aisle with Martin, Rebecca, and Peter. She looked toward me once, then immediately opened her folder. An independent judge entered, everyone rose, and for the first time since this started, Nobody in that room could pretend my occupation had anything to do with the evidence. Martin presented Brierwood's position carefully. The old covenant was no longer the center of his argument. Instead, he described historical access patterns and claimed the proposed corridor was necessary for reasonable connectivity between Brierwood and the county road. Laura waited until he finished. Then she stood with a certified copy of my grandfather's deed. She walked through the chain of title, the recorded plat, and the eastern boundary one document at a time. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear pages turning behind me. Then she placed Brierwood's own alternative access plan into the record. 18 months old. Professionally prepared. Entirely outside Whitmore Farm. The judge looked at Martin. Counsel, if this route exists, what makes access across the Whitmore parcel necessary? Martin paused. The alternative presents substantial additional expense and grading requirements. The judge looked down at the plan again. Expense is not the same thing as absence of access. Vanessa shifted in her seat. Laura then produced the Brierwood meeting minutes showing Vanessa had attended the presentation where that alternative route was discussed. The date was highlighted. Her name was listed among those present. I watched Rebecca lean toward Martin and whisper something. Peter stopped writing. The judge asked for the recorded instrument supporting Brierwood's original assertion of a right across my property. Martin acknowledged that the covenant previously referenced did not directly burden Whitmore Farm. That sentence mattered more than any dramatic speech I could have made. By late afternoon, Brierwood had failed to establish the right it claimed to cross my land, and its requested access relief was denied. The judge's reasoning stayed where it belonged: deeds, plats, historical evidence, and the existence of another route. Not my job, not my robe. Outside the courthouse, Laura handed me her copy of the order. That is the easy part finished, she said. Easy. She almost smiled. Brierwood's board received the meeting records during discovery. Several members are asking why they were told your property was necessary when an alternative route had already been presented. 3 days later, Robert Ellis, Brierwood's vice president, called Laura rather than me. The board had opened an internal review of legal spending connected to the dispute. Martin's firm had also advised the association that it would not continue advancing claims unsupported by the title record. Nobody lost a license. Nobody was dragged away in disgrace. Reality was quieter than that. Rebecca and Peter had already stopped appearing on the correspondence. Martin sent Laura a professional notice confirming the firm's revised position. Vanessa faced something harder to dismiss: her own minutes, her own authorization, and invoices paid with homeowners' money. A week later, Brierwood scheduled a special board meeting. I did not attend. I was replacing fence posts along the eastern pasture when Laura called. Vanessa has been removed as president. I looked across the same 40-foot strip she had once treated like a line on somebody else's planning map. What about the road? The board voted to proceed with the alternative route. I pressed fresh soil around the base of the new post with my boot. For months, Vanessa had tried to make my farm the cheapest solution to Brierwood's problem. In the end, the most expensive mistake was assuming cheaper meant theirs. The first frost came 3 weeks after Brierwood chose the alternative route. I found it silvering the fence wire at 5:40 in the morning, turning every cedar post along the eastern pasture pale beneath the first light. My breath showed in the air as I carried a thermos toward the barn. Nothing about Whitmore Farm looked victorious. That was what I liked about it. The same tractor needed fuel. The same gate near the south field dragged half an inch when the ground was wet. The same 84 acres waited for somebody to maintain them. Beyond the tree line, survey crews had begun marking Brierwood's new access route, safely outside my boundary. Their machinery was distant enough that I could barely hear it. Laura had closed most of my file the week before. Brierwood formally withdrew its remaining unsupported claims against Whitmore Farm, and the association agreed to resolve the documented legal expenses connected to the dispute. More important to me, the board confirmed in writing that future association projects would require title verification before anyone claimed rights over neighboring private property. Vanessa's name appeared nowhere on the final correspondence. Robert Ellis had become acting president, and from what Laura told me, his first board meeting involved more questions about budgets and records than landscaping. Martin sent one final professional letter confirming that his firm considered the access dispute concluded. Rebecca and Peter never contacted me again. I did not celebrate any of that. I put the final documents where they belonged. My grandfather's deed went back into the worn manila folder. The certified order rested behind it. Brierwood's alternative access plan went into a separate file. Then I locked the fireproof cabinet. The same cabinet I had thought about that Monday morning when 3 lawyers saw me walk into a courtroom wearing a robe. Later that day, I drove 42 miles to work. My black garment bag hung behind the driver's seat exactly where it had months earlier. Mud had dried around the edges of my boots, so I changed shoes before entering the courthouse. In chambers, I hung my work jacket beside the robe. For a moment, I looked at both of them. One smelled faintly of cedar and cold air. The other smelled like pressed wool and the old wooden closet where it spent most of its time. Vanessa had believed the second one was the source of my power. I understood why. A robe changes how a room looks at you. It makes people stand when you enter. It gives you authority inside a courtroom, within strict limits that matter as much as the authority itself. But it never gave me one additional inch of Whitmore Farm. The deed did that. The survey did that. The record did that. And when Brierwood challenged those records, another judge, not me, decided what they proved. That distinction was the entire point. That evening, I returned home before sunset and walked the eastern fence. Fresh survey flags for Brierwood's alternate road were visible through the trees, bending away from my property exactly where the county plan said they should. I stopped at the post I had replaced during the board meeting and pressed my glove against the rough cedar. Months earlier, Vanessa had stood near that same line and told me development was happening whether I approved of it or not. She had been right about one thing. Development continued. It simply continued on land Brierwood actually had the right to use. The next morning, I would put the robe on again. That night, it stayed 42 miles away at the courthouse while I closed the barn, checked the gate, and watched darkness settle across the fields my grandfather had protected with nothing more dramatic than a properly recorded deed. 3 lawyers had gone pale when they discovered I was a judge. They thought that was the twist. It was not. The robe stayed at the courthouse. The deed was what kept my farm.